phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," feels particularly relevant today for a number of reasons. Hi there everyone, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, your host, and today we're going to be checking out this new Ozzy Osbourne album, Patient Number 9. This is the 13th studio album from the Prince of Darkness himself, and for the most part, it's pretty much exactly what I was expecting. As a follow-up to 2020's Ordinary Man, an album I frankly haven't really been the biggest fan of, I was hoping for more of maybe a reach back into a more classic Ozzy sound or style. I really just wanted some more tracks that sounded like some Jakey Lee era stuff, like Please. But that was definitely a bit of wishful thinking, because while there are some pretty solid tracks here that have some pretty good classic moments from Ozzy, or some songs that get a little bit adventurous with the guitar parts, there are just as many tracks that feel like they can't really pin down where they want to go with this album. Like the track Parasite, which has some decent guitar work but ends up sounding like something off of No More Tears mixed with like a Muse track from like the mid-2000s, which at points does work, but it's mostly an awkward fusion, especially on the chorus, which on first listen was just incredibly jarring and would maybe be like a little bit better if the auto-tune on Ozzy's voice was just not so distracting. Oh yeah, just like Ordinary Man, there is a lot of auto-tune on this record, and a lot of it is used properly as touch-up for like some of the vocal work, but there is just as much, if not more, that carries entire vocal tracks in a way that's really unflattering. It's like the audio equivalent to the Bogdanov twins. Like, you get what they were going for, but the results leave a lot to be desired. And I get it, there's not going to be many people who have incredible pipes into their 70s. That's just not how biology works, but it does make me wonder why there isn't more accommodation in the writing to kind of help make up for the lack of vocal range instead of just artificially filling in the blanks. Past the fairly generous auto-tune, thematically what you can look forward to on Patient Number 9 is basically like 2 or 3 things. A response to people who didn't think Ordinary Man had enough heavy tracks on it, some career-spanning sounds, and some throwback tracks which have been chewed up and regurgitated, and more ballads. Many of these tracks feel like they're jumping either so far back as to feel like Sabbath tracks, namely on the tracks that do feature Tony Iommi, like Degradation Rules or No Escape From Now, or you have this 90s throwback sound which is very prominent on most of the other tracks, especially the stuff that features Zakk Wylde. But there is a very clear lack of mojo when it comes to covering the 80s sound, with the exception of like the 80s ballads. And there's moments that feel like there's little nods here, and like namely the beginning of the title track and the very start of the album, Patient Number 9, kicks off with these really goofy samples of laughter which mercifully don't stick around for too long, but it definitely feels like a very dated nod. Like, yeah, the whole sampling yourself laughing, and I mean, it's like old Ozzy laughter too. It's like he didn't like pull any old samples or anything, like they just recorded like old man Ozzy laughing, and it just sounds kind of weird. And that title track is fine. It definitely feels like it's trying to be a little bit more grandiose than it deserves, especially with its like 7-minute long runtime, which is pretty much unnecessary. Really, the only other time that the album even touches on 80s sounds, it's only lightly passing over some of the more ballad-oriented tracks, like on the track here that features Eric Clapton, that track being One of Those Days, which, you know, sounds great, except for the fact that it's Eric Clapton. Go ahead, look up Eric Clapton's 1976 rant. Past that unfortunate collaboration, the track is one of the weaker moments on the album. The chorus of One of Those Days, I Don't Believe in Jesus, feels kind of weak as far as writing choices go. That track is followed up by another ballad with A Thousand Shades, which is another fairly forgettable track, past this being the second track to feature Jeff Beck, who's doing a fine job on guitar. His part is actually one of the better things on this song, but it still feels really wankery, especially towards the end of the track, where it feels like he's kind of trying his best to channel some of the Randy Rhoads energy, but it just kind of ends up being okay. Past that, we have Mr. Darkness, which had me a little bit worried, as the intro of that track is very ballad-oriented, and I was about to be really annoyed if Ozzy thought it would be a good idea to put a gauntlet of ballads in the middle of this album. And this track does still have a lot of those elements, but it does have some more rock and roll, like driving beats that are very reminiscent of the material on late 90s era Ozzy albums, which is appropriate as Zakk Wylde is the guitar player for this track as well as the next couple of songs. The solo makes that very obvious right off the bat if you couldn't tell, with these very pinch harmonic, heavy wah-focused guitar solos. It's very par for the course as far as Zakk Wylde is concerned. Nothing Feels Right, as a song title, pretty much sums up my feelings for a lot of this album. Like, half of the tracks on this album have started, and I've audibly said to myself, like, what the fuck, why? Because while most of these songs aren't terrible, and in most cases are perfectly listenable, it doesn't really feel right that so many of these tracks just feel so underwhelming. And I get that Ozzy isn't exactly as energetic as he used to be, but I can't really believe just how dry some of the writing is here. At, like, the start of every track, every first impression has been rough, and knowing Ozzy's writing style and habit of having, like, you know, like 4 or 5 minute tracks that more or less go nowhere except for a guitar solo to break up the chorus, which then leads back into a reprisal of the chorus, these tracks all just feel like overdone ideas with some flashy guitar work to pad out the fact that there isn't really anything worth revisiting on a lot of these tracks. I mean, back when, like, rock and roll and heavy metal as genres were a lot more fresh, you could kind of get away with stuff like this because a lot of it hadn't really been done yet. But there is a reason why there aren't any bands trying to rip Ozzy past just his voice, mind you. All of his music at its core is simplistic to a fault. It's the same reason why every Ozzy album for the past 20 or even 30 years has had maybe like 1 or 2 worthwhile tracks, and the rest have just been like a glorified delivery system for the singles. Anyway, Nothing Feels Right is a forgettable track. Evil Shuffle is actually a slight improvement, even though it's just about as generic as they come. It's at least a track that feels a little bit more in touch with the present and doesn't seem so worried about playing off of nostalgia. Actually, I have very similar thoughts on Immortal, the second track on the album. Degradation Rules as a track is still pretty solid. I think it is one of the better cuts here, largely due to Tony Iommi's contributions on the writing. My thoughts are still largely unchanged from my reaction video, though I think the harmonica bits have grown on me a bit more. Dead and Gone starts off fairly promising, but gets, you know, kind of repetitive a little bit quickly. I do kind of dig the atmosphere that the track builds, but that's really one of the only things that I do end up liking about this song. God Only Knows is one of the only moments on the album where I think the classic ballad style actually ends up working out really well. Of all of the slower tracks on this album, this one actually feels really heartfelt. It's kind of giving me similar vibes to David Bowie's Black Star, specifically off of that record, the track Lazarus, especially with lines like "My life has become the setting sun," or "Better to burn in hell than to fade away," which are both concerning for different reasons, but it really feels like Ozzy is putting his awareness of his mortality out there on this one, and it's really emotive and really touching, and I actually think that it ends up making this one of the best modern era tracks for Ozzy Osbourne. It's also the only track on this album where I felt like from beginning to end it was great. Like, very solid song all the way through, no complaints. The final song, Dark Side Blues, is more of an outro track than anything else. Like the title suggests, it's a very moody, heavily effects processed blues track, which is fine. I don't think it adds very much to the track listing, but it certainly doesn't take anything away from it. So Patient Number 9 as a whole is very much far from the best of Ozzy Osbourne's work, but I think that that's kind of what most people were expecting, myself included. Like I said earlier, most of the work that has been put out over the past few decades worth of Ozzy's releases have just been largely underwhelming, with a few massive singles packed into each album. That's just kind of how it's been. And it feels very much the same here, and even though I'd say there's a lot of filler here, none of it is particularly bad or hard to sit through. At worst, it's kind of forgettable. But at the best moments on this album, you get some really solid top-tier Ozzy, and even though you have to wade through quite a lot of like middle-of-the-road stuff to get to those moments, I do think that it ends up making up for at least most of those. And even though a lot of this album can't really make up its mind if it wants to be a heavy album or if it wants to unleash ballad after ballad and kind of ends up feeling directionless, it ends up being okay in the end. I really just wish that this album was maybe like 8 or 9 tracks and was cut down to like 35 minutes, because I think an hour of modern Ozzy was a little bit overambitious. Anyway, I think Patient Number 9 is a pretty solid 4. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this album in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe. Check out my Instagram, my Reverb, and my Depop. Links to those are in the description below. Thank you all so much again, and we'll see you on the flip side.